6 days. 6 days without food, and the taste of rust from the ship's water pipes had become the only flavor left in their mouths. In the belly of a Liberty ship somewhere in the Atlantic, 300 German women pressed against each other in the darkness, their stomachs no longer growling but silent, surrendered to the emptiness. Among them, 23-year-old Gertrude Steinberg clutched her knees to her chest, feeling the sharp edges of her own ribs through the thin fabric of what remained of her Luftwaffe auxiliary uniform. She had stopped counting the hours after day 4. Now she only counted breaths, wondering which one might be her last. The woman beside her, barely 19, had stopped moving that morning. No one checked if she was alive or dead. There was no point. They were all headed to the same place anyway. America, the land where, according to everything they had been told, German prisoners were tortured, experimented on, and worked to death in desert camps. The propaganda minister himself had warned them, better to die fighting than to be captured by the Americans. But they hadn't died fighting. They had been captured near Cherbourg when the Allied forces swept through France, and now they were cargo, human ballast in the bottom of a ship that reeked of engine oil and despair. When the engines finally stopped, Gertrude thought it was the end. The whole door opened, and sunlight poured in like liquid fire, blinding eyes that had seen nothing but darkness for nearly 2 weeks. She tried to stand but collapsed immediately. Her legs were water, her vision spinning. American soldiers appeared as shadows against the light, their voices sharp and foreign, but instead of clubs or rifles raised to strike, hands reached down, lifted, carried. The first thing that didn't make sense was the smell. Not the sulfur and smoke of a burning country, but something else. Grass, wind that carried the scent of cattle and earth. When her eyes finally adjusted, Gertrude found herself looking at something impossible. A harbor, yes, but beyond it, a city standing whole and untouched. No bomb craters, no collapsed buildings, no fires. Houston, Texas, stretched out under a September sun as if the war existed only in some other universe. They were loaded onto trains, then trucks, each transition bringing new waves of panic. This was it. They were being taken to the execution grounds. The older women whispered prayers. The younger ones went silent. But as the trucks rolled through the Texas countryside, the world outside the canvas flaps told a different story. Children played in front yards. Farmers waved from their fields. Towns with ice cream shops and hardware stores passed by as if millions weren't dying an ocean away. It was September of 1944, and America looked like a country that had never heard of war. For Gertrude, raised in Hamburg, the vastness alone was incomprehensible. In Germany, you could cross from one town to another in an hour. Here, they drove for half a day and saw nothing but land stretching to the horizon. Cattle grazing in pastures bigger than entire German provinces, oil derricks pumping like mechanical insects against the sky. This was the America they had been told was on the verge of collapse. This was the nation that would crumble under German might. The propaganda had been specific and terrifying. Americans were mongrels, Joseph Goebbels had said, a mixture of races without culture or honor. They would rape German women, use them for medical experiments, work them until they dropped dead in their fields. The guards would be sadists, chosen specifically for their cruelty. Every German soldier and auxiliary had been told the same thing. Death was preferable to American captivity. But when the trucks finally stopped at a camp near Hearne, Texas, what waited for them defied every expectation. There were fences, yes, and guard towers. But the men who met them weren't screaming. They weren't even carrying rifles. Instead, men in wide-brimmed hats and worn denim stood beside the military guards, looking more curious than hostile. One of them, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and gentle eyes, actually tipped his hat. "Afternoon, ladies," he said in accented English that one of the women translated. "Y'all look like you could use a good meal." A meal? Gertrude almost laughed. It had to be a trick. Give them hope, then snatch it away. That's how torture worked. Build them up before breaking them down. She had heard the stories from the Eastern Front, knew what prisoners could expect. But the cowboy, for that's what he clearly was, just stood there with what looked like genuine concern on his face. "Name's Jim McCready," he continued through the translator. I run a ranch about 10 miles from here. You ladies will be helping us out once you get your strength back. But first things first. Let's get you fed. Fed. The word hung in the air like something alien. Gertrude's group of 30 women was separated from the others and led not to punishment blocks but to a long wooden building that smelled of something impossible. Food. Real food. Not the thin gruel of the ship or the black bread of wartime rations, but something that made their empty stomachs clench in desperate hope. Inside, tables were set. Actual tables with plates and forks and napkins. Cowboys and local women bustled around with pots and pans, and the smell was overwhelming. Meat, vegetables, fresh bread. It was too much. Several women began crying. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. "This isn't real," whispered Ilse, a nurse from Berlin. "They're playing with us. It's psychological warfare." Gertrude nodded. Of course. Make them think they were safe. Make them drop their guard, then spring the real torture. It was sophisticated, she had to admit, crueler than beatings because it played with hope itself. The cowboys and guards seemed confused by the women's reluctance to approach the tables. They stood there, 30 skeletal figures in tattered uniforms, staring at a feast they couldn't believe existed. "What's wrong with them?" one cowboy muttered to another. "They're scared," Jim McCready said quietly. "Can you blame them? Lord knows what they've been told about us." He stepped forward slowly, the way you might approach a spooked horse. He picked up a piece of bread from the table, tore it in half, and took a bite himself. Then he held out the other half to Gertrude. She stared at it, her hand trembling. 6 days without food, and here was bread, white and soft and impossible. But her mind screamed warnings, poison, drugs, some kind of trick. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. 30 starving women facing tables loaded with food, unable to bridge the gap between their hunger and their terror. The cowboys exchanged glances, clearly baffled. These weren't the fierce Nazi fanatics they had expected. These were terrified young women who looked like they might collapse at any moment. Finally, it was the youngest among them who broke. A girl named Marie, barely 18, took a stumbling step forward, then another. Her hand reached out, shaking like a leaf in wind, and touched the bread. When nothing happened, no guards rushing forward, no laughter at her weakness, she picked it up. The first bite was so small it was almost nothing. The second was larger. By the third, tears were streaming down her face. "It's real," she whispered in German. "It's real food." That's when the dam broke. Gertrude found herself moving forward with the others, her body overruling her mind's protests. The first taste of beef stew was like swallowing sunlight. The bread might have been made of clouds. After 6 days of nothing, every flavor was an explosion, every texture a miracle. Some women ate too quickly and became sick. Others could only manage a few bites before their shrunken stomachs protested. But they all ate, tears mixing with the first real food they had seen since France. Jim McCready stood back, his hat in his hands, watching these women discover that their worst fears were lies. He had expected prisoners, enemies, maybe even some resentment or anger. But what he saw were human beings reduced to their most basic need, grateful for the simple act of being fed. One of his ranch hands, an older man named Buck, sidled up beside him. "Never seen anything like it," Buck said quietly. "They really thought we were going to starve them?" "Appears so," Jim replied. "Makes you wonder what else they've been told." As Gertrude ate, slowly, carefully, she kept waiting for the trap to spring, for someone to laugh and snatch the food away, for the real torture to begin. But it never came. Instead, a cowboy refilled her water glass. A local woman brought out a pie, an actual apple pie, and began cutting slices. The guards chatted casually among themselves, paying the prisoners no more attention than you'd give to any group of hungry workers at a meal. The sun was setting by the time the women were led to their quarters, not cages or punishment cells, but actual barracks with beds and blankets and windows that opened to let in the evening air. Gertrude lay down on a mattress, the first she had felt in weeks, her stomach full for the first time in months. Outside, she could hear cowboys calling to each other as they finished their day's work, their voices carrying across the Texas plains like something from another world. She thought about the propaganda, about everything she had been told. Americans were supposed to be monsters. But monsters didn't feed their enemies apple pie. They didn't tip their hats and say, "Ma'am." They didn't look concerned when you were too scared to eat. As sleep finally took her, Gertrude realized that either everything she had been taught was a lie, or this was the most elaborate deception in the history of warfare. Tomorrow would tell which one it was. But tonight, for the first time since her capture, she wasn't hungry. And that simple fact was already beginning to crack the foundations of everything she believed about the enemy she had been taught to hate. The morning sun crept through the barrack windows, and with consciousness came the familiar ache of hunger. Gertrude's eyes snapped open, her body already prepared for disappointment. Last night had been a dream, surely, a hallucination brought on by starvation, but the mattress beneath her was real, the blanket was real, and from somewhere outside came a smell that made her stomach clench with desperate hope. Bacon, coffee, the impossible scent of breakfast. Around her, the other women were stirring, each one going through the same process of remembering, doubting, hoping. Ilse sat up slowly, her nurse's training making her suspicious of everything. "It's a psychological tactic," she whispered. "Feed us once to make the starvation worse. Classic conditioning." But when the door opened and Jim McCready appeared, hat in hand and a slight smile on his weathered face, he didn't look like a man planning torture. "Morning, ladies. Breakfast is ready when you are. Take your time." Take your time. As if time was something they owned, as if they had any choice in their fate. But there were no guards pushing them, no rifles pointed at their backs, just an open door and that maddening smell of food drifting on the morning air. They moved as a group, still suspicious, still waiting for the trap. The mess hall was already busy with activity. Cowboys sat at long tables, eating and talking in their drawling English. The kitchen was visible through a serving window, where local women and camp cooks worked over massive griddles and steaming pots, and the table, their table, was set again, not with scraps or gruel, but with a spread that belonged in a fever dream. Platters of eggs scrambled and fried, bacon in piles that seemed obscene in their abundance. Biscuits, golden and steaming. Gravy, white and thick. Butter, real butter, not the gray substitute they had known for years. Jam in 3 different colors. Coffee, black and strong, and pitchers of actual milk. Fresh milk, not powdered, not watered down, but white and rich and impossible. Martha Holtzman, a 30-year-old signals operator from Munich, stood frozen at the table's edge. In her mind, she could hear her training officer's voice from 1942. "The Americans will try to break you with false kindness. They'll offer you comfort, food, friendship. It's all lies. The moment you trust them, they'll destroy you." But hunger is stronger than propaganda. And when young Marie, the girl who had broken first the night before, reached for a biscuit, Martha found herself moving too. The first bite of bacon was like tasting sin. Salt and fat and smoke, flavors that had vanished from Germany years ago. She wanted to eat slowly, to savor it, but her body had other plans. Her hands shook as she reached for more and more and more. "Easy there," one of the cowboys said gently, moving closer. "You'll make yourself sick eating too fast. Been there myself after a long cattle drive." Martha flinched, expecting a blow for her greed. But the cowboy, a young man probably no older than her brother would have been, just pushed the water pitcher closer to her. "Drink between bites. Helps it settle." This kindness was unbearable. It would have been easier if they had been cruel. Cruelty she could understand, could resist. But this casual concern from an enemy? It made no sense in the world she knew. Across the table, Gertrude watched Jim McCready talking with his ranch hands. They weren't discussing the prisoners like cargo or animals. They were planning the day's work, discussing which pastures needed attention, which fences required mending. And then she heard something that stopped her cold. "We'll need about 15 of the ladies for the east field," Jim was saying. "Gentle work to start. Don't want them overdoing it after what they've been through." After what they've been through. As if their suffering mattered, as if they were people worthy of consideration. Anna Richter, barely 21, suddenly broke down sobbing over her eggs, great gasping sobs that shook her entire body. The cowboys looked alarmed, unsure what they had done wrong. But the other women understood. It wasn't sadness. It was the complete collapse of everything they had believed was true. "I wrote my last letter home 3 months ago." Anna gasped between sobs. "I told my mother I would die with honor rather than be captured. I said the Americans would torture us, that it would be worse than death, and now they're feeding us eggs." "Eggs? Do you know how long it's been since my mother has seen an egg?" The cultural collision was complete. On one side, American cowboys who had grown up with abundance as a birthright, who saw feeding hungry people as simple human decency. On the other, German women who had been raised in scarcity, indoctrinated with hate, prepared for torture, and instead finding themselves drowning in plenty. Jim McCready noticed the crying and walked over slowly. Through the translator, he asked, "Is the food all right? Is something wrong?" How could they explain? How could they tell him that his kindness was more devastating than cruelty? That every bite of biscuit was dismantling years of carefully constructed hatred? "The food is good," Gertrude managed to say. We didn't expect to be fed," Jim finished, and there was something in his eyes that might have been pity or might have been understanding. "Well, out here in Texas, we don't let folks go hungry. Don't matter where they're from. Don't matter where they're from. As if nationality was no more important than hair color. As if being German, being the enemy, was just an incidental detail." The breakfast continued, and slowly the women began to talk among themselves. Not about escape or resistance, but about the food. The way the biscuits fell apart in layers, the perfect ratio of salt to fat in the bacon, the sweetness of the jam, made from berries they couldn't identify. It was easier to focus on flavors than to confront the earthquake happening in their minds. Then came something even more disturbing. The cowboys began to clear their own plates, not ordering prisoners to do it, not leaving it for subordinates, but picking up their dishes and taking them to the kitchen. One of them, an older man with gray in his mustache, even took Martha's empty plate with a nod and a touched brim of his hat. "Thank you for the help today, ma'am," he said through the translator, even though she hadn't done any work yet. "Appreciate you ladies coming out." Appreciate, as if they had a choice, as if they were volunteers rather than prisoners. The cognitive dissonance was making Gertrude dizzy. After breakfast, they were given work assignments, not chain gangs or punishment details, but regular ranch work. Some would help in the kitchens, others would work in the gardens, a few would assist with the lighter cattle work. They were given gloves to protect their hands, hats to shield them from the sun. Water buckets were placed strategically so they could drink whenever they needed. Ilsa, still suspicious, whispered to Gertrude as they walked to their workstations, "They're fattening us up for something. This can't be real." But as the days passed, the pattern continued. 3 meals a day, each one abundant beyond reason. Meat at nearly every meal, vegetables fresh and cooked, bread without sawdust, desserts, actual desserts, as if sugar wasn't being rationed anywhere in the world. The women gained weight, their cheeks filled out, the hollow look left their eyes, and more disturbing than the food was the attitude. The cowboys treated them not as prisoners, but as workers. They said, "Please" and "Thank you." They offered help when the work was heavy. They shared their own food, offering tastes of local specialties like chili and cornbread with an eagerness that seemed genuine. One evening, 2 weeks into their captivity, Gertrude found herself sitting outside the barracks, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink. Jim McCready walked by, stopped, and sat down on a fence rail nearby. "You know," he said, the translator relaying his words, "my grandfather came here from Ireland during the famine. Arrived with nothing but hunger and hope. Folks here fed him, gave him work, gave him a chance. That's what America is supposed to be about." Gertrude wanted to respond with something about propaganda, about how this must all be calculated. But sitting there, full-bellied under a peaceful sky, she couldn't find the words. Because if this was propaganda, it was the most effective kind. The kind that came with biscuits and gravy. The kind that killed hatred with kindness, one meal at a time. That night she wrote in the small journal she'd been allowed to keep. "They continue to feed us as if we are guests, not prisoners. Either Americans are the greatest deceivers in history, or everything we were told was a lie. I no longer know which possibility frightens me more." The impossible feast continued, day after day. And day after day, 30 German women found their worldview dissolving like sugar in coffee, sweet and irreversible. They had been prepared for American cruelty. They had not been prepared for American abundance, and certainly they had never been prepared for American kindness. The food was winning a battle no army ever could. It was conquering not territory but hearts. And in the mess halls of a Texas prison camp, the real war, the one for souls and futures, was being won with nothing more violent than apple pie. The apple pie had been the breaking point, not the first meal, not the abundant breakfasts, but a simple dessert on a Thursday evening in October of 1944. Gertrude had watched the ranch cook, a cheerful woman named Betty, pull 3 steaming pies from the oven and announce with genuine pride, "Made extra today. Thought you girls deserved something special after all that fence work." Deserved. As if they had earned kindness through labor, as if they were workers, not prisoners. That night, Gertrude sat with a blank piece of paper, trying to write to her sister in Hamburg. How could she explain that she was learning to ride horses, that she was being paid 80 cents a day in camp currency? That yesterday, a cowboy named Tom had spent an hour teaching her to throw a lasso, patient as a schoolteacher, laughing when she accidentally roped herself instead of the practice post? She wrote carefully, knowing the censors would read every word. "Dear Margaret, I am alive and well in Texas. You will not believe this, but I'm learning to be a cowgirl. Yes, like in the American movies we watched. Before the war, they give us 3 meals every day, real meals. Yesterday I had steak. I know this sounds impossible, but it is true. The Americans are not what we were told." 4 weeks later, the reply came, smuggled through Red Cross channels. Her sister's handwriting was shaky. "Gertrude, your letter frightened us. Are they forcing you to write these lies? We know what the Americans do to prisoners. Please, just tell us if you are alive. You don't have to pretend." Pretend? But the calluses on Gertrude's hands were real. The weight she had gained was real. The laughter that came easier now, that was real too. By November, the 30 women had been split among 3 ranches. Gertrude's group of 10 worked the McCready Ranch, and they had fallen into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to normal. Wake at dawn, breakfast with the Cowboys, morning work with the cattle, lunch under the vast Texas sky, afternoon mending fences or tending horses, dinner together in the long hall, evenings of exhausted sleep or quiet conversation. Martha Holtzman had discovered she had a gift with horses. The animals, which terrified most of the women initially, seemed to trust her instinctively. Jim McCready watched her work one morning, gentling a spooked mare with nothing but whispered German in patient hands. "You've done this before," he said through the translator. "My uncle had a farm," Martha replied, her hand still on the horse's neck, "before the war, before everything changed." "Well, you've got the touch," Jim said. "How'd you like to be our main horse handler? Same work credits, but you'd be working with the animals instead of the fences." A choice. He was offering her a choice. In 3 years of military service, no one had ever asked Martha what she would like to do. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Anna Richter, who had sobbed over eggs that first morning, now rode out with the cattle drives, her German accent mixing with attempted cowboy calls. Yeehaw sounded ridiculous in a Bavarian accent, but the Cowboys loved it, teaching her American slang with endless patience and amusement. Ilse, the suspicious nurse from Berlin, had become the unofficial ranch medic. When a cowboy named Dale cut his hand on barbed wire, she cleaned and bandaged it with the same efficient care she would have given a German soldier. Dale tried to pay her from his own pocket. She stared at the dollar bills in complete confusion. "For fixing me up," Dale explained. "But I'm a prisoner," Ilse said slowly. "You're a nurse who helped me out," Dale replied. "That's worth something, prisoner or not." The ideology they had carried for years was crumbling under the weight of daily kindness. Every shared meal, every please and thank you, every moment of being treated as human beings rather than enemies, chipped away at the foundations of what they had believed. One evening in December, as a cold wind swept across the plains, the women were invited to attend a barn dance at a neighboring ranch. Not ordered, invited. They could say no. Most couldn't imagine saying no to the possibility of music and normalcy. The barn was warm and filled with locals, cowboys from various ranches, and even a few American soldiers on leave. When the women entered, conversations paused, but not with hostility. Curiosity, perhaps, caution, certainly, but not hate. The music started, fiddles and guitars filling the space with sound that transcended language. One brave cowboy, barely 18, approached Gertrude and held out his hand. Dance? She had not danced since 1941. Her feet remembered the steps, even if the music was different. American country music instead of German waltzes, but rhythm was rhythm. And for 3 minutes she was not a prisoner or an enemy. She was just a woman dancing with a shy young man who stepped on her feet twice and apologized both times. Later she wrote in her journal, "I danced tonight. The world is ending and beginning at the same time." The letters home became increasingly difficult to write. How could they explain that they were gaining weight while Germany starved? That they had warm clothes for winter while their families shivered in bombed-out buildings? That yesterday, Jim McCready's wife had taught them to make American apple pie, laughing and patient as they struggled with the unfamiliar recipe? Some stopped writing altogether, unable to bridge the gulf between their reality and their family's suffering. Others wrote carefully edited truths. We are safe. We are fed. The Americans follow the Geneva Convention. They couldn't write the whole truth, that their captors had shown them more kindness than their own government ever had. Then came April of 1945, and with it, whispers that grew to shouts. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe was ending. The women gathered around a radio in Jim McCready's kitchen, listening to the news in English they now partially understood. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. They should have felt despair. Their nation was defeated. Everything they had fought for was lost. But standing in that warm kitchen, surrounded by people who had become something dangerously close to friends, many felt only relief. It was over. The dying was done. "What happens to us now?" Anna asked Jim. "You'll go home," he said simply. "When transport can be arranged, back to your families." Home. But what home? The letters from Germany painted pictures of devastation. Cities flattened, families scattered, starvation everywhere. Here in Texas they had work, food, dignity. There they would return to ruins. The last months passed in a strange twilight. Still prisoners technically, but treated more like seasonal workers whose contract was ending. Some cowboys gave them small gifts, carved wooden boxes, leather goods made in spare time. Betty, the ranch cook, wrote out recipes on index cards, pressing them into Gertrude's hands. "So you can make cornbread in Germany," she said, as if cornmeal would be available in a nation of rubble. When the trucks finally came in August of 1945, the farewell was surreal. Cowboys shook their hands. Some of the local women hugged them. Jim McCready stood with his hat over his heart as they loaded up and called out, "You ladies take care now. You're always welcome back if you find your way to Texas again. Welcome back. Enemy prisoners, welcome back." The world had gone insane with kindness. The journey home was a descent from plenty into famine. Each mile closer to Germany, the destruction grew worse. By the time they reached the makeshift repatriation center in France, the contrast was complete. From abundance to apocalypse, from being treated as workers to being processed as defeated enemies. But they carried something that couldn't be taken away. They had seen another way of living. They had experienced strength without cruelty, power without humiliation. They had learned that enemies were just people, and that kindness could survive even war. Gertrude returned to Hamburg to find her family's apartment building gone, replaced by a mountain of rubble. She found work with the American occupation forces. Her ranch learned English and cowboy slang, making her valuable as a translator. When American officers heard she had been a prisoner in Texas, they often smiled. "Good people in Texas," one said. "They treat folks right." Years later, in 1952, Gertrude received a letter forwarded through multiple agencies. It was from Jim McCready. "Saw your name in a newspaper article about rebuilding Hamburg. Glad you're doing well. The ranch is still here if you ever want to visit. P.S. Betty says hello and hopes you still remember how to make cornbread." She kept that letter for the rest of her life, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moment, there were people who chose kindness over cruelty, who fed their enemies not because they had to, but because they couldn't imagine doing otherwise. The 30 women who had refused to believe that first feast in Texas became unwitting ambassadors of a different narrative. When they told their stories, many Germans didn't believe them. It seemed impossible that the nation they had been taught to hate had shown such mercy. But the women insisted, and slowly their stories spread. They had been prisoners. They had been enemies. But in the vast spaces of Texas, they had been given something more valuable than freedom. They had been given dignity, shown trust, and treated with a kindness that transcended war itself. And that kindness, more than any bomb or battle, had shown them what America really was. Not the monster of propaganda, but a nation where even prisoners could find mercy at a Cowboys table.